RM Sotheby's is the world's largest collector car auction house by total sales. They are the preeminent market maker of high-quality collector cars and collections, regardless of size or complexity. By working in partnership with the Sotheby's team and its network of 80 offices in 40 countries, RM Sotheby's has established the largest client network of any collector car auction house in the world. Join the RM Sotheby's family by connecting with one of their car specialists at rmsotheby's.com or contact me directly at gstanley@rmsotheby's.com. LLC TLC is here to save you money on all of your vehicle purchases. LLC TLC will permanently register your classic cars in Montana to avoid any annual renewal fees. As your registered agent, they will handle everything for you so you never have to step foot in Montana. And as a listener of this podcast, LLC TLC is offering 30% off your entire package. Simply go to llctlc.com/classic or mention this podcast when you contact LLC TLC directly. All right, welcome to the Collector Car Podcast. Thanks for joining me this week. One thing I want to give a heads up before we get started with our interview today is my Pontiac GTO that was on Jay Leno's garage about 6 weeks ago will be at the Pontiac Nationals up in Norwalk, Ohio this coming weekend. So if you want to see that car in person, be sure to check it out there and find me as well. I'll give you my limited edition GTO poker chips. And I've got a few of those, so you want to collect them all. Anyways, for this episode, I want to welcome back a guest, Philip Richter. Philip, how you doing, buddy?
Great, Greg. Happy to be back on your show.
Yeah, this is great, man. I appreciate it. I always have a really good conversation with you. And we had a pre-call beforehand, and I told you about, the GTO, and you said, you know what, I'm not a muscle car guy, but I love Pontiac GTOs. So why is that?
I mean, it's probably two reasons. One is, I think, John DeLorean was such a change agent at General Motors. He was so unlike anyone else at the company at that time. He would drive through walls and break through barriers and say what he thought and didn't fit the typical GM profile as an executive. So he pushed the limits of a lot of people and things. And the GTO was really, for greater or lesser degree, he was very, very instrumental in that car hitting the road. And I think that's one of the reasons. The other reason is because there was a GTO in the famed Paul Newman movie Slapshot that Paul Newman drove in the movie. And it was, I think, like a classic, lime green color from that era, very kind of period correct color. And I always loved that car when I watched that movie. So there's a two kind of random reasons, but I think it's a cool looking car. It's unique. And now that Pontiac is no more, it really becomes that much more special.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm not a GTO guy either. And I always loved the pony cars, the muscle cars. But when I got my first 911, it took me down a different path, as you know, entirely, where I'm like, I don't care for muscle cars anymore. And then as I'm consigning and helping out with the big Ferrari GTO that sold, I get asked about this Pontiac GTO. So I was dealing with two GTOs at the same time, of opposite ends of the spectrum. And honestly, at the time, I tried to get, I think it was Car and Driver, to recreate the GTO versus GTO, but a couple reasons it wouldn't have worked. But my first experience, I never thought I would own one. I always thought they were cool looking, but I wasn't ever pursuing one. And my first ride in a GTO, I was probably 19 years old, and a guy had a 1964, and he had put the big 421 race engine in it, like the one that raced the Ferrari GTO on Car and Driver back in 64, I think it was. And I swear he shifted when the front tires came off the ground. It's not what happened, but as a 19-year-old, you were just blown away, So
Yeah.
Those cars are great for going straight.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. How are you involved in cars? And then we'll get into some market stuff.
I've always had a passion for mechanical things, starting with my Honda 50 that I still have in my living room. The actual bike I grew up with, I had it restored to 100 points, and it's a wonderful piece. And as I got older, out of college, I got into global motorcycle touring. I rode my motorcycle pretty much all over the world, from Cuba to Turkey and beyond. I met through grammar school. I was very close friends with a guy in my class, a classmate whose dad owned the local Porsche, Audi, Volkswagen dealer in Greenwich, Connecticut, Malcolm Prey. Malcolm he passed away about 10 years ago, but he was a very revered collector in the industry. And young Malcolm, my friend, unfortunately died in an automobile accident when we were 16.
Mm.
But I got closer to his dad as a result of that. And his dad had a really, really robust collection. And I ended up going all over the world with him, showing his cars with him. And I think that's probably was the biggest influence on my collecting habit and my interest in the car world. Today, I collect predominantly German cars and pre-war BMW motorcycles. I do have a huge love of 30s cars. I love the big Duesenbergs and Packards of that era. And I a couple of years ago, I bought a Packard 12, V12 Dietrich Victoria. So I've dipped my foot into the pre-war world, which is a lot of fun. And I've recently, I'm on the board of the Malcolm Prey Foundation in Greenwich, Connecticut, Bedford, New York. Malcolm's cars, we still have a lot of his cars at his garage, his building. It's a beautiful facility. And I'm on the board there, and we actually do a lot with young entrepreneurial activities for young kids, teaching them about many of the things that made Malcolm successful in his business, which are timeless principles. You know, things like stay in school, don't do drugs, and value your reputation.
Right.
I'm also on the board of the Revs Institute in Naples, Florida, which is the Miles Collier collection. Miles has been a huge influence on my life as far as understanding collectible cars as really meaningful objects of history. And his recent book, The Archaeological Automobile, is, I think, one of the most important works that has ever been written in regards to collector cars of any and all shapes and sizes and forms. And so it's been a real honor to be involved with Revs and all the amazing initiatives that they have going on there, from actually racing vintage Grand Prix cars in the collection at Goodwood and out at Laguna Seca and all over, to all of the archives that that Mr. Collier has collected in his lifetime, which actually, from a fascination standpoint, eclipse the actual physical metal of the cars. Of the items that are in the collection at Revs are staggering, and the volume is daunting of the things that they have there. So it's a very exciting organization, and I think probably is the most well-positioned organization to be a leader of thought and action for the future of the collector car industry, looking out the next 50 to 100 years.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, and we talked before. I have not made it to that collection, and I definitely need to put it high on my list. So
Yeah, I urge all your listeners. I mean, you kind of can't go to your grave without seeing the Revs Institute. It's got to be a bucket list item. I would allow a lot of time or multiple visits, because it's a little bit like when you go to the Prado in Madrid. You know, nobody realized Goya painted that many paintings. You can't get through it in a week. Mr. Collier has some of the most phenomenal Porsche race cars. I think Porsche wishes they had his collection and their collection, and a lot of Grand Prix cars from the 20s, some very interesting Ferraris. It's just an incredible place.
yeah, that's awesome. Well, cool, man. Well, why don't we get into some of our conversation here? A little bit about the market out there. I mean, what are your thoughts on the overall market? And then I know you had some interesting points about the bifurcation towards investment grade. So I think that's really interesting, because my podcast from last week was kind of about Porsche market trends, and I do have some questions for you specifically around Porsches. But kind of give us your overview.
Yeah, I mean, I remain surprised by the by market levels for collector cars. You know, if you think about the last decade, we had a lot of cheap money, a lot of government support of elevating markets through quantitative easing. We had very cheap energy prices. We didn't have geopolitical conflicts to speak of like we have today with the Ukraine and with Israel. Globalization over those past decade was going gangbusters. That's all changing, and companies are beginning to think more about certainty of supply rather than price of supply. So these things are all inflationary for the markets. They're also complex, and they give, you know, the price of money really matters. And so the Fed has been hiking rates, and we haven't really seen a commensurate uh, radical change in the rate of inflation, although inflation is certainly cooling. And you've had, incredible market behavior in the stock market with a handful of stocks, the Magnificent Seven, leading markets higher and higher and higher. Normally in this environment, you would expect, as interest rates rose from a very, very low point for over a decade to what's probably a historical post-war average of 5%. Still, like, mortgages now are, well in the 6% range. One would think that that would trickle down to the collector car world, and you'd see the handbrake being pulled on a lot of transactions. I think we're in a very weird interregnum period where the reality of higher interest rates hasn't quite hit the market in its entirety yet. And what I mean by that is, when rates rose in the beginning, it was pretty sudden and precipitous. And you had banks like Silicon Valley Bank, or First Republic. They were not set up for higher rates, and they blew up. They effectively failed. I'm not saying we're going to see more bank failures, but the pig is not fully through the python, so to speak. So this rise in interest rates is going to take a long time to meander through the financial system, and that's going to affect the automobile market eventually. I think it already has, and I guess that's the point of our topic today. I think the way higher interest rates have actually affected the collector car market is that there's been a bifurcation. And what I mean by that is there's a split between the absolute best cars that money can buy, that are both rare, that have provenance, that are unobtainium, that rarely come to market, versus the cars that Barrett Jackson sells every year at Scottsdale or at Palm Beach, or they're very different, all their auction sites. And I think what you're going to see is that rift, that split, continue, where investment grade cars command a much, much higher premium, and there's more demand for that type of car, versus cars that have stories that might not be super positive. For example, a car that was an automatic got switched to a manual. Right. Cars that maybe had a lot of paint work or have excessive mileage. These types of cars are fun, and there's a whole market for that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with those cars. It's great. People can have a great time with a car that's been converted to a manual, or cars that aren't perfect. But from a value perspective, I think we're all scratching our heads every year at Pebble Beach. We think, oh, things are going to come in and things will stabilize, or things will get cheaper. And cars just keep getting more expensive. But what you have to look at is what's coming to market. And if you look, for example, at Gooding's auction last year at Pebble Beach, I mean, there wasn't one car that David had in that auction that I wouldn't want in my garage, right? So these cars are coming out of the woodwork. There seems to be a very nice supply of investment grade cars, but it's not infinite, and the market knows that. And so I think, what we're going to see is the best of the best are going to continue to be desirable, regardless of where interest rates are, regardless of where the stock market is, because collector automobiles at that level are a legitimate asset category. They're no longer, this is not a hobby industry anymore. It's an industry, right? It's a bona fide business where these automobiles are, as Miles Collier says, they're really important artifacts of history, and they're getting recognized as such. So, whether it's an extremely rare Duesenberg from the 30s or a Pagani from 5 years ago, these cars have a place in an investment portfolio, so to speak. Although I don't like to espouse people to invest in cars as investments. It should be a passion-based investment. But what I'm saying is that the market has evolved very much in the last 15 years to a point where cars are legitimate. It's a legitimate asset class. And so really high quality cars of various eras are the ones that are going to get the high bids and the solid bids, and that from a probability standpoint are very likely to continue to get high bids because they're rare, because they have provenance, because their color combinations are great, because of their condition, their mileage, all of these factors that go into it.
It's interesting you say that. So what? And I'm not going to be the leading the horse to water. But what is your thought on the best way to sell one of those cars?
So that's a very good question, Greg, and it doesn't have an easy answer. You know, Bring a Trailer has is another part of the collector car market that has shocked me over the years. I mean, I think what Randy has done with Bring a Trailer has completely revolutionized the entire industry. He will go down in history as as an indelible figure who changed the way we buy and sell cars. At the same time, when you talk to someone like David Gooding, there are certain cars that I think will always be sold in a live environment, like what happens at Monterey or at Amelia or at other big shows like Hershey. And some of these cars, some of maybe the very, very ultra exclusive coach built cars of the 30s, they generally find a better audience at a Gooding or at an RM at Sotheby, at Monterey. But we're seeing Duesenberg show up on Bring a Trailer. We're seeing Packard show up on Bring a Trailer. We're seeing Paganis show up on Bring a Trailer, right? We're seeing supercars, 959s, F40s. They're starting to be sold on Bring a Trailer. So I think what's happened is there's room for everybody, right? There are certain cars that can be sold on Bring a Trailer or on other auction sites that are virtual. And then there's those cars that are going to be consigned to the big auction houses who are professionals who know those cars, and maybe in some cases have even sold them to their prior owner in the past. And many of these cars have long histories, the Otis Chandler and people like that, in history of bought and sold cars. So, I don't think there's any binary answer to that question. I think that there is still a place for terrestrial auctions, but it's definitely on the higher end. Barrett Jackson has been very successful, but that's on the lower end, and there's a huge market there too. I'd say the difficulty is in that middle range market where, I think of a car like a Porsche 944 Turbo, very cool car. If you found one with under 5,000 miles, it's going to command some cash. If you've got one that has 134,000 miles on it, it's probably not going to be worth a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, it's funny because I was in a collection recently, and it was race cars and Indy race cars, and he had sold one overseas, and the Indianapolis Speedway is upset because he's like, "You'll never get that car back in the U.S." And he's like, "Well, I'll let you know," because the same guy overseas wants to buy like 6 more. And he's like, "Well, I'll let you know if I sell the next one." And I said, "Well, this is where you need an auction, because you've got a guy that definitely wants it, and you got another guy that definitely wants it, especially for something like you're talking about, these super high, like what is the market? If I have that, not a 944 Turbo, but if I have that Dietrich Packard, one hasn't been on the market for 5 years, and it's one with the whatever disappearing, all that kind of stuff. You might, unless you put it out there publicly, you might be off by 500 grand. You just don't know,
Yeah, you just don't
hard
know.
to nail it down. So,
well, and the real power sellers, like if you look at someone like Dean Lumbach, or you look at someone like Anthony Serra at 1600 Veloce, who are both very close friends of mine, they are really adamant about the no reserve auctions, because when something's no reserve, it's going to sell. And when something's going to sell, that ignites passion and fervor in the market, and people know that no matter what, this thing's going over the block. It's interesting that Bring a Trailer just sent an email yesterday about this reserve not met functionality that they're adding to the website, which I think is a very interesting idea, to get those cars that were, that had a reserve, to possibly get them sold.
So what's really interesting about that, because I received that as well, is I've helped, this is pre-RM days, but I had helped some people sell cars on BAT, and it really worked out well if it was a no sale, because then the seller didn't have to pay, or the buyer didn't have to pay the 5% fee. and
Yep.
that put towards the price of the car and it got it sold. Well, I would imagine if I were bringing a trailer, I'd be like, wait a second, you probably find out, they probably find out a lot of times that car sold to the highest bidder after the fact. Like, wait a second, we're missing fees here. How can we,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
can we get it
Sure.
to where it continues on, which it makes total sense. Keep the conversation going with the person that showed the
Yep.
most interest to see if you can get
Yeah,
something
I mean,
more in.
in an auction environment, sometimes the heat of an auction can be a real driver of a transaction, and then often other times it can be a turnoff. And sometimes people
Yeah.
need 24 hours to cool down and get their mind rational again and say, "Okay, I really do want this car. I'll pay a little bit more. Let me talk to the seller." Right, and then you
Yeah.
get a deal done. Yeah.
Well, a perfect example is 2 years at Monterey. I was bid spiting, and there was a gorgeous F40. I think it was an F40. Anyways, he was the underbidder, lost the car, got his contact information. The car, something happened, the deal fell through or whatever. So I offered the
Yep.
car to him for basically what he bid, less than what he raised his hand up, and he decided to pass on it. And that speaks to the auction fever. He had his six buddies there with him in the room,
Yep.
and all that kind of
Yep.
stuff. So that speaks to the auction fever for sure. The other
Yeah,
positive thing.
and
Oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I mean, there's nowhere better to see the auction fever than at Barrett Jackson, right?
Yeah,
I mean, when you go to a Barrett Jackson auction, it's more about the bars and the beer and the trinkets and the experience than it is actually about the cars. And Craig's been incredibly successful at creating this as an entertainment venue, because that's really what it is. It's an entertainment venue.
yeah. When you have a Resto Mod Chevelle sell for like $600,000,
Yeah,
there's more than just the car taking, being a factor. So
for sure. For sure.
one thing
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk about is, you talk about these high end cars. You mentioned Pagani. I've noticed, especially from my podcast last week and Porsches, the gap, and you can even lump the LFA, Lexus LFA, into this. The gap,
Yep.
because of options, has become insane. So I'll give you a couple examples. The LFA, nobody wanted the Nürburgring package when it came out. They only made like 50 of them. Well, now the
Yep.
Nürburgring package is like twice the price of a base LFA. I was looking at the 918 Spider versus the Weissach. Big
Yep.
difference. The Porsche 959 Comfort plus Sport. It's like a $2 million
Yep.
difference. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think Porsche has been brilliant in their marketing, particularly the last decade, where the variants of 911s that are available, the option packages, permutations of different options is staggering. I mean, when you order a Porsche today, you really have to know what you're doing. You have to spend time and study. Forget about just even a base 911 and the things you can do with stitching and calipers and chrono and all the different things, seats. But then when you get into the GT3 RSs and the ST now, which has become just everyone's going cuckoo over the ST, they've done a masterful job at creating this incredible pipeline of various product options that take a fundamental 911 and make it either rare or different or sporty or all of the above. And that's been driving, the value of more modern Porsches even higher. And I think that is dripping down into the older Porsches where people are saying, well, wait, 959 Comfort, well, there's also a rarer option than that, et cetera, et cetera. So
That's
the
a good
people
point. I
are,
didn't think, yeah.
investors are starting to look back and say, a 911S, really, well, how many did they really make in that year? And that's a special car. And I think that's the brilliance of Porsche's marketing efforts in the last, I think it really started kind of in late 2008, 9, where they started really changing up a lot of these models, where ultimately, like when you see a modern 911 today, I mean, they're all the same from a optical perspective, but then you see the hood is carbon fiber with the louvers, and there's a little bit of wider flare, and it has a different wing, and the interior, the seat belts, or the body color, and I mean, you can just go on and on and on about the permutations, and it's really like mass customization what they're driving towards, with categories that are very rare, right? So within the GT3 RS category or within the ST category, there's different things you can do there as well. And that's causing, a frenzy of people who are obsessed with owning something that no one else can own.
Right. Yeah. Do you think it's reaching a saturation point? I mean, I was in a collection the other day. They had the ST, they had the Classic, they had the Dakar, they had, do you feel like it's reaching there? I mean, and what is a special number nowadays? Under 500, under 400, under 100? I mean, it's
I mean, I do. I think it's reaching a zenith where, at a certain point, like a silver 911S, you know, or a modern, let's say a brand new 911, just a base model, the performance levels of the base models are so unbelievably good that you're really on the margin talking about bragging rights. You're not talking about usable performance differences, right?
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
yes, many of your listeners will probably say that's heresy to say that, but you know, you can't use the capabilities of these cars in ways that they were
Right.
engineered for. It's just not even possible for the average person who
Right.
works in New York City and can afford a $200,000 911. They're not maximizing the engineering thresholds of that vehicle. They're not driving it to the edge of adhesion on Lime Rock Park, right? Not happening. So I think we're reaching a little bit of a zenith there. I think Porsche has done an incredible job at creating this mystique. A company was virtually bankrupt in 1990. I mean, they were in huge trouble. The when you look at the Porsche Boxster and the first generation air cooled 911, there was a parts bin sharing situation going on there, right? And
Yeah.
they had to cut costs wherever they could. The Deutschmark was strong. They even did the partnership with Mercedes on the 500e and Audi on the RS Avant. They needed the money, right? The only reason why the Mercedes 500e was be able to be built at Porsche is because they had a lot of excess capacity that
Right.
Mercedes didn't have
Right.
at the time.
Yeah.
So how the fortunes have changed their Porsches is a fascinating topic that's probably worth a podcast alone.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but so I think, I think that's right. And I think, there's a lot of Porsches out there. I mean, maybe it's because I live near Greenwich, Connecticut in the summer and I live near Palm Beach in the winter, but I kind of get bored. There's a lot of Porsches on the road in those areas. That's all you kind of see. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well,
So
cool.
your question on rarity, though, I think is a very important one. So, what used to be a rare car was things like, like your example of a Packard Dietrich, right? There's I have a Dietrich Victoria, and I think there were 9 of them built in total of that Dietrich Victoria catalog car. There's 5 of them left, 4 of them left. I don't know, something like that. And then there's some of these so-called limited edition cars where they're only building 1,100 of them. There's also a whole lot of questions around how many Ferrari F50s were really made, right?
Right. Right.
We know what the factory says, but if you got them all on a field together, is it more or less? I mean, that's more of an audit question, but I think if a car is really rare, it's got to be you know rare in the highest end. It's got to be in the single digits, like a Pagani situation where they do a certain one-off of a Zonda or whatever. In the middle range, like the Porsche range, it's got to be less than 500, maybe less than 300. I love what Mercedes has done with the Black Series because I think that's truly, from an engineering
Yeah.
standpoint, it's nuts because they take an already insanely fast and high performance car and take it to another level, but they do it in low volumes. Like I have an SL65 Black Series, and there are 175 of them in the US, and they're 350 worldwide. That's a pretty low production car for the modern era.
Yeah, the reason
Right?
I ask is because I know the last call for the Mopars was, I think it was 2000, and there's 5 versions. I'm like, that's a lot of cars out there,
It's a lot of cars. Yeah.
And I would
Rare
be
rare doesn't mean what it used to mean. I mean, looking at early Ferraris, those are rare. These are handmade, very low production cars. I mean, today rare is more in the high hundreds.
the one Porsche I keep thinking of. I've only seen 2 of them. Is that 918 Spider Edition? Like you had the option to
Mm-hmm.
buy this 911 Turbo black with
Yep.
acid green if and I think they supposedly they made 918 of them, so they're not that rare.
Mhm.
But I've only seen two.
Yeah,
I
I've
always thought
seen
that was
one.
yeah.
I've seen one in a collection in Germany that had the actual, the car that you had to buy with it, the 911, and there's a set of chairs that you
Oh,
get, and they're all painted to match the same color as the two cars. And I think they're not Herman Miller chairs, but they're some very fancy designer, and they're Porsche 918 chairs.
wow, that's awesome.
So
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
surprised I don't see more of them since there's 918 of them out there. So.
yeah, yeah.
Um, well, what else did you want to touch on the marketplace? I got a couple other questions to ask you, but anything else from a market perspective?
I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens out at Monterey. I suspect, the auction facilities at Gooding and RM, you'll continue to see a high grading of what they're offering for sale. Uh, it's very hard to compare auctions year over year because it depends what cars are coming to market that year.
Yeah.
RM could sell 100 cars at a lower value, or they could sell 50 cars at a much higher value and have different numbers. So you have to really parse through the data to really understand what's happening in the market. But I think you're going to see at Monterey, you're going to see a continuation of this theme of just better and better and better cars that are just big dollar, really, really investment grade type things.
Yeah, I know ARM has, I don't think they've announced them all yet, but some big Ferraris coming in, which would be really cool to see.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And David Gooding has a whole panoply of incredible cars that are going to come to market
Yeah.
at Monterey and at England after that. So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I continue to think there's very few industries that attract the quality of people that the collector car world attracts. And that can be at any level. It doesn't have to be at the Duesenberg Pagani level.
Right. You're right.
I mean, there's a whole midsection of the market. Like I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole on the E46 M3, which is a really interesting car because if you think about the E46, you can buy a convertible E46 M3 with a SMG transmission for not a lot of money, right? Not an expensive car for what it is, right? Or you can buy a delivery mile CS that's a deep six-figure car. And then in the middle, you've got, the coupe that's a six-speed manual, which commands a huge price gap over the SMG. And then the final 2 years, they made the competition package in those cars, which are pretty rare, actually. Speaking of rare, I think like 8% of the total E46s have the competition package. Um, and so things like that are really fun to look at and to study and to be involved with. And then you start meeting the people who own these cars,
Yeah.
right? And it's just an awesome kind of cadre of people who are fans of maybe what was the last truly analog M3, arguably one of the better M cars they ever built. And so for me, like I think another trend you're seeing in the sport of collector cars is there's these sub markets that are very interesting and people who are obsessed of those category of cars. And I think that's gaining strength. Like, for example, the R129 here on my shoulder, the painting of it, there's a whole cadre of people now that are becoming R129 fanatics. And they're really interesting people. And when you get to meet them and know them, at the Turtle Invitational last year, we had a whole group of 500E owners bring cars from California, right?
Wow.
I think we had like 7 or 8 500Es come from out west, and these people were just so interesting and so passionate and knew every nuance about the cars, and I just love that about the industry. And so these various different niches that are out there. There's always been niches in the industry, people who love Thunderbirds and people who love Mustangs and people who love Cobras. But I think because of the variety of the market now, there's so many subcategories. Miatas. I mean,
Yeah.
Miata is a whole, forget about the racing side of it where people are running, first gen Miatas up at Lime Rock all the time. But people love Miatas and they do all these things together. They do tours, they do drives, they do events, they hang out, they talk on the phone. It's cool. It doesn't matter if it's a $10,000 car or $100,000 car or $1 million car. Like it's the same affliction. It's just different categories. And I really love that about the industry.
Yeah, and typically you're having the same conversation. Doesn't matter what the car is. You're asking the same questions, the history of the car, tell me about the car, and you can
Yeah.
relate. Whether it's a $5 million car or a $20,000 car. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, that's really cool.
Exactly.
Well, I think my last question for you is, if I gave you a pot of money, what would you go out and buy tomorrow?
Wow. Well, I guess a pot would depend on, how big is the pot, but
What is the
I
one
think,
car that you just like, man, if I had a shot at that?
I that's a really hard question, Greg, because there's so many things out there, and as you go through life, it's funny how your tastes change and how things
Yeah,
evolve, you know, and I think that my tastes have sort of evolved where I'm not a supercar guy. I don't have any interest in owning, a Pagani or even a Ferrari of that ilk, like a La Ferrari or something of that sort. I would say though that there are two cars I think that are emerging as maybe possibly the most important cars of the young timer era or the early young timer era, which is a broad definition of demographics, but people who are like our ages or a little younger that grew up in the 80s or the 90s, things that they liked. And I think I would rephrase your question. What are the two cars I'd like to have in my garage today that I don't
yep.
have? And one would be unequivocally the 959 Porsche.
Mm,
And I think the 959, I've said this in other interviews that I've been interviewed with, it's such a groundbreaking landmark automobile that represents a leap forward of the likes that nobody in 1985 would even think about except for Porsche, right? And so, all-wheel drive, uh, several hundred horsepower, 6-speed manual transmission, huge flares. A 959 is a car that when you see it in person, it's an experience. A photograph doesn't do a
yeah,
959 justice,
yeah,
right? And so I think that was a seminal turning point for the industry as a whole when you talk about, supercars, which these are not supercars, but they were supercars in that era. Today, a Bugatti Veyron is a supercar, or these high horsepower Paganis and things of that sort. The other car I think that falls in that category is the Ferrari F40,
mm,
and that's a car that it's not rare. As despite what people want to think, the Ferrari F40 is not a rare car. They built a lot of Ferrari F40s, right? But it is an incredibly raw, distinct car that has a silhouette that harkens back to actually to the Dino
hmm
and even to the 308 and the 328, right? And so arguably, if you didn't put a price on a Ferrari 328 and you put it on a pedestal and said, what is that? 99% of the world could say it's a Ferrari. They know right away it's a Ferrari, not because of Magnum PI, but just the
sure,
ultimate look of it. It's one of the most beautiful designs of any car ever built. It's a shame it's slow. It's not that exciting to drive, but the F40 took that silhouette and just made it massive, mean, and beautiful. And the F40, the build quality was a tough time in Ferrari's history there, but there's carbon fiber in that car. There's a lot of lightweight alloys in that car. The fact that Enzo was still alive when the car was being developed, I think, is very important in history. So I think those two cars represent to me, despite even putting demographics and age aside, even if I was a younger collector, I think I'd be looking at these types of cars because they represent a landmark turning point in the industry where incredible horsepower was actually affixed to something that could use it on the road.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. What are your thoughts on the Canepa redesigned 959s?
So that's a very interesting point. I mean, I'm a purist, and I in normal circumstances, I would say that is an absolute criminal offense to take a beautiful 959
Yeah,
and make it modern. But I did have a conversation with a pretty respected collector who's been eyeing one, because of its beauty, and it's actually, what the 959 maybe should have been from the beginning. But a lot of those technologies didn't exist. So you could think about it as a 964 converted to a Singer. A
Right.
959 Canepa is sort of a similar analogy. I'm sure Bruce wouldn't like me saying that, but it's similar in the sense of taking that car to another level and making it more modern and usable. So, I think it's a preference thing. I personally don't want anything in my garage that's been modified to a degree where it can't be unwound. It's one
Right.
thing changing out a radio head in a 500E and putting it back and keeping the old radio in the back. It's another thing completely re-engineering a car to that degree. Um, but there's a market for it, and so as long as there's a market for it, there must be demand, and if there's demand, there must be people that like it. And that's again the beauty of this industry. We all have different opinions on what we like, and everyone likes something different, and can show it, can express that through what they collect and what they drive, what they revere, what they love. But I have not driven the Canepa 959, but I can only imagine it's just an incredible experience, because the actual 959 itself, if you put yourself back in 1985, 86, 87, is a pretty incredible car even by today's standards.
Yeah. 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 And Canada has such a name and history in the Porsche world for so long. That's provenance, to the car. I mean, if it
Yeah.
was uh, Greg Stanley 959, it wouldn't be worth anything, So,
No, that's right. I mean, he's built a brand.
yeah.
One other thing I think I would just mention quickly is, it's been a long time since I've purchased a new car. I'm just sort of not interested in buying new cars. Nothing really has called me. And last year at Monterey, I was going to have dinner with Keith Martin at Sports Car Market, and I was walking downtown Monterey, and there was a BMW sitting in front of the restaurant, and it really caught my eye. It had huge flares. It had a very aggressive stance. It had a carbon fiber roof. And I looked in the window and it had a 6-speed manual.
Yeah.
And there was a guy sitting in it just fiddling on his iPhone. And I said, God, what is this? He goes, oh, it's the brand new M2. I
Mm.
just picked it up. And I looked at the car and I said, well, how do you like it? And he goes, like everyone in Monterey, they own a couple dozen cars during car week. He said, well, I got about 35 cars, and this is the best car I've ever had. And I thought, well,
Wow.
that's interesting. So I went online that night and I started researching the new M2, the current design, not the previous one, which is a very high demand car and very popular among enthusiasts. And sitting on the bench in front of the lodge during Pebble Beach, I ordered one online, and it finally arrived about a month ago. It took almost a year to get it, and I have to say, um, it's a really, really special car because it's rear wheel drive. It's a bi-turbo 6-cylinder, so it makes 450, 460 horsepower, and you can order it in a manual,
Mm.
a 6-speed manual, and you can order it with carbon fiber race seats, and there's a lot of cool things you can do to it. And it's expensive, but it's not a 911 price, right? It's like half of a base 911. And I just thought it'd be interesting for your listeners to hear someone who doesn't buy new cars. I got literally was just gobsmacked by this M2, which is kind of a benign 2-door coupe.
What
And
color?
I got it in Brooklyn gray,
Okay.
which I think is a kind of a unique color. I have an E30 M3 in white and tan, and I was going to order this car in white and tan to match that car. And I just like the Brooklyn gray is a very distinct color, and I don't think they're going to offer it again next year. So it's kind of a different thing.
Well,
But
just being
it's
a
still amazing. People are building performance cars like this. Like, I'm very surprised that BMW even approved building a car like this. It's a raw kind of analog throwback car with a
yeah.
giant screen with all this technology in it that you can kind of ignore and enjoy driving the car like an E30 M3.
Yeah, I'd say that's one of the future collectibles for sure. Just the manual aspect of it, then you add in everything else. I mean, that's
Yeah.
quite a cool car. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today on the Collect a Car podcast. Where can we find you next?
I'll likely be at Monterey, and then probably go to the Audrain. Um, I'm going to do our Turtle Rally in the fall, in late September. The Turtle Invitational Car Show goes every other year, so we're on an off year this year, and we do a rally to a fun destination. We're going to be going up to Lake Placid, New York, where the Winter Olympics were held in 1980, and that's a 3-day rally. We have 30 cars, so that'll be happening in September, which will be really fun. And yeah, and I'm hoping to enter my Packard at Pebble Beach next year for
Oh, nice.
2025. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much again for being on the Collector Car podcast, Philip.
Thanks, Greg. Always a pleasure. Great job.